Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mad in America. This is your host for today, Ayurdi Dhar. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Mount Mary University and a spotlight interviewer for Mad in America. Our guest for today is Dr. Dana Becker. She's currently professor emeritus of social work and social research at Bryn Mawr College. Dr. Becker has also practiced as a psychotherapist for over 3 decades. She's the author of numerous books and articles, and her interests range from criticisms of concepts of stress and positive psychology to medicalization of female suffering via the PTSD diagnosis and earlier the borderline diagnosis. We will talk about this and a lot more. Dr. Becker, welcome to Mad in America.
Oh, thanks very much.
So let's jump into this. Now, you have raised concerns about something called therapeutic culture. Could you just briefly tell us what it is and what are some of your concerns and criticisms of therapeutic culture?
In what we call therapeutic culture, which is the culture we're all swimming in, the air around us is infused with psychological concepts, values, and institutions predicated on those. So the idea is that in therapeutic culture, the psyche is the principal object of our attention. So the psychological is seen as a main source of problems in our society, and the health, and I put in quotes, of our psyches seem to be an ultimate goal. So these shared assumptions about the psyche and its importance and the importance of the self shape our values, they shape our behaviors and even institutions. So a major critique then is that this emphasis on the psyche and the self really makes the world less visible, makes the problems of society, the structural problems, the institutional problems less visible to us. And because I have done a lot of work looking at sort of how individualism shapes our psychological culture or the therapeutic culture, I think we have to go back historically and consider that our American reliance on ideas about individualism really also shape therapeutic culture.
Okay, so my next question would be, you're also a psychotherapist. So how do you bring this consciousness into your work with your patients or your clients? So how do you do that? How does that affect your work?
What I believe is that we have to bring context into therapy. We have to bring social context into therapy, but we also can't stop in the therapy room. We have to understand that a 45-minute session does not a world make. That if, for instance, women whose problems have long been medicalized see their own problems as medical problems to be resolved, and if we or somebody like me as a therapist doesn't see all problems that way, that's a perspective that I have to bring. It doesn't mean that if somebody suffers from clinical depression, we're not going to help them to get medication for that. But it's also true that as a family therapist and a person who's worked a lot with women, I'm going to be asking about not only the family context, the marriage, or the relationship, all of that, but also understanding the client's perspective on the world and on gender, and how, if I see women, how women see themselves. And I have to tell you that it's very interesting for me to have spanned several decades doing this work, because when I started out, nobody ever came in saying something like, quote, "I'm bipolar," right? You'd never hear that. That was unknown, and nobody was doing self-diagnosis. As I continued to work, women would come in and say things to me like, "My mother thinks that I'm bipolar." So I don't even like people calling themselves a diagnosis. They don't say I have bipolar disorder. These days it's I'm this and I'm that. So when I would ask, the origins of the mother's belief or the client's belief about why, this diagnosis seemed to suit, often they'd say to me, I remember in the 80s, there was a book called Mood Swings, which I fortunately never read, but I made an attempt not to read. And some clients and their parents or their partners would read these things and immediately say, oh, if you're angry this day and angrier this day than the last day, that must mean you have mood swings, and that means you're bipolar. So for me as a therapist, to use this as an example, to unpack this is to find out what that means in terms of the context in which those ideas arose. So what's going on there? Sometimes the woman is feeling justifiably angry, but her partner or her parents are saying there's something wrong with that, essentially. And why are you, and you're angry, and that means you have mood swings, and that means you have a diagnosis. And this is how emotion gets medicalized. That doesn't mean there is no such thing as bipolar disorder. I'm not saying that. People are always criticized. When you take a position like this, it's not as extreme as people assume, and when you're a therapist, you have to delve deeply enough to understand the context of what the client is bringing.
So I think what you're referring to, often we have, especially at Mad in America, we address some criticisms of psychiatry, but what you're talking about is a larger societal, cultural narrative that exists, and it changes our self-definition.
Yes.
I have students who would come in saying something similar, that I am this, and I have a therapist, and she won't give me a diagnosis, but I know I am this.
That's right. I mean, there are other concepts too that are they're equally important, that are diagnostic in a certain way for the therapist, because I'd have clients coming in saying, for instance, oh, I'm feeling really terrible this week. I'm having a pity party. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm really interested, just for myself, in unpacking ideas like this. Where do women get the idea that when they're sad or upset about something that's going on, that they're being self-pitying, and the pity party aspect is really denigrating, So for a therapist not to be inquisitive or curious about that is really problematic to me, because if I understand something about some forms of gender socialization, then that woman bringing that idea to me is bringing a whole world of gendered associations.
So let me ask you this. These psychologized narratives, right? Or therapeutic narratives that take issues of power and psychologize them. Right. Why do you think they've become so powerful and so pervasive? Like, is it a matter of who does it benefit?
Well, we won't get into the sort of history of the psychological professions, but there has been, there certainly is benefit for the psychological professions, which have proliferated over the decades. There is benefit in the medicalization of human problems. There's no question about that. Back in the day, when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual first came out, number one, it was probably less than an inch thick. Now it's so bloated that, anything can be called a psychological problem. And so the professions have benefited greatly, and the number of psychological professions have proliferated. So now you have professional counseling, and social work, which used to be a different kind of profession. The other part of it comes, I think has a lot to do with the gendered nature of ideas about emotion, because women have always been the primary candidates for psychotherapy, for self-help books, for all kinds of psychological advice. And when Oprah came along and some others, it became more popular to consider talking about problems that had been more deeply hidden, or at least hidden from public view. I also believe that our own reliance, our own sort of veneration of science, and I'm talking about this historically because now there's an anti-science camp and a science camp and so on. But until fairly recently, from the 19th century onward, there had been a tremendous veneration of science, and the scientization of all phenomena became predicate to many things. And this certainly also influenced medicalization. I mean, Freud himself, way back in the day, never wanted psychiatry to become a medical profession. It was really in America that it was decided that you really should have, you should become a medical doctor, or you had to become a medical doctor in order to become a psychiatrist. Freud never wanted that.
I want to kind of ask you about your chapter, since you were talking about context, and your most recent chapter is Where Has All the Context Gone? Mm-hmm. Right? And you talk about what feminist therapy used to be and what it has now become. I'm going to use the word toothless almost, right?
Right.
Could you tell us more?
I'd have to say that in one sense, there really is no feminist therapy today. There are not people who call themselves feminist therapists. There are people who are feminists who do psychotherapy, and that's very different. And the calling of oneself a feminist means a lot of different things to many, many different people. So in the beginning, there was consciousness raising, a very middle class white phenomenon, right? Back when, in the day, 60s and 70s. And what Betty Friedan, the mother of what some people call the mother of modern feminism, used to call navel gazing. Mm-hmm. And this was the beginning, actually, of a critique of therapy for women as a sort of, do we really want people to be looking inward, rather than looking outward for the source of their problems? Fairly quickly on, the ideas that consciousness raising did bring to therapy, which was the idea of bringing the social context into the therapy room and helping women to achieve greater activism outside the therapy room. Mm-hmm. That quickly became subsumed as professionalization really took over. So it was a fairly short dynamic period. And today, I think that when people talk about, people do not use the term feminist therapy anymore. But what I have argued in and what I've seen out in the field actually too, and what I've argued in this chapter is that for women, trauma has become the sort of watchword. Trauma and women, have become a kind of bundle that I think a lot of therapists who consider themselves feminist would see together. Mm-hmm. So let's figure out how you've been traumatized. Now, in some ways, one could say, just as one can say that the therapeutic culture does confer some benefits on people, to talk about traumatic events has become destigmatized, or much more destigmatized. So have psychological problems. And this is very helpful to many people. Even back to the 1980s, it was rare for therapists to ask a woman if she'd been sexually or physically abused, for example. This was just not done. Now it's routine. All right, this is all good news. It is all good news for these problems to come out of the closet, and for the context, for the social and societal context of psychological problems to be visible. Mm-hmm. Having said that, when everything in the world is labeled traumatic, there is a loss of meaning. There's no question. I mean, if I'm traumatized because I have too many text messages, as opposed to being traumatized because I've been a prisoner of war. I mean, these are things that are labeled traumatic these days, and the idea of trauma has lost meaning. The other problem is that those who, particularly in America, practice therapy, assume that every disaster and natural disaster that occurs induces trauma in everyone. This is, by research standards, simply not the case. And it's interesting to think about the fact that, when American psychologists, for instance, went over in the wake of the tsunamis that happened, a decade or more ago, they wanted to offer psychological help to the victims of trauma. And the people there were saying, I don't have a house. I need some place to stay warm, and my family has no food, and you're talking to me about being traumatized. It's also true that the events of 9/11 were cast very tightly, were placed very tightly within the trauma narrative, to the extent that 10 years after 9/11, the American Psychological Association's house organ, which is called the American Psychologist, which all psychologists receive if they belong to the APA, had to basically put out an entire issue that was nothing but a research apologia for all of the psychological work that had insisted that everybody was going to be traumatized. Everybody who had witnessed or seen it on TV, or the children who were exposed, everybody was going to suffer. It turned out, as researchers continued to study this phenomenon, that this was a very small percentage of the population. But now, when research is done, it turns out that a fairly high percentage of the population will say that they've experienced at least one or more traumatic events in their lifetime. And this is probably a gross overstatement, but the use of the term is legion.
And I guess that kind of ties in with Ian Hacking's idea of the looping self, that what happens when you have a concept that kind of has a life of its own and changes your self-definition and then your experience. I have wondered if trauma probably is the next biggest thing that has come after the medicalization narrative. Do you have any stories or examples of how specifically trauma has been co-opted or absorbed, and further medicalized women's problems?
Well, actually, this comes down to, I think, the narrative about PTSD. I mean, the way that I would frame this is in terms of the change that occurred when the criteria for PTSD were transformed back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. In the diagnostic manual, in the DSM-3. So initially, events that were causative of PTSD had to be considered outside the realm of human experience. Many, many feminists agitated for these criteria to be broadened so that women whose experience of sexual, physical abuse and other forms of abuse would then be able to be included, and that PTSD diagnosis could be applied to them. Now, initially, I have to say to you, I was really taken with this because I was studying the borderline diagnosis, which I could not abide and still can't at the time, and felt, well, PTSD is the only diagnosis, it was at the time, the only diagnosis that had actual external situational causes. And I thought, this is a wonderful thing. So we expand the diagnosis. Well, what I found, to my horror, and changed my position in writing about it, I changed my position I did a complete 360. I was horrified at how often the PTSD diagnosis was just slapped on women. They didn't meet all the criteria, And they said, okay, well, I've had this abuse. And it's not to say we shouldn't take note of the abuse and its ill effects, its after effects. But I became sort of horrified to think of this being having become another tool of the medicalization of women's suffering. And so I think in this sense, if we talk about the trauma narrative, feeding into the PTSD diagnosis, that's how I'm thinking about it. And one of the great, I think, a terrific bit of research done by my friend and colleague Jean Marisek and Diane Kravitz, when they interviewed, this is back in the 90s, interviewed a host of feminists, therapists who called themselves feminist therapists. They were quoted really as saying, this is the only diagnosis that I ever give. It's not that I give it to every woman. This is the only diagnosis I ever give. And I tell people, well, you have PTSD, and this is a normal reaction to trauma. Well, first of all, PTSD symptoms aren't a normal reaction to trauma. Otherwise, we wouldn't be calling it a disorder. So this also worried many of us, and I think came along after PTSD as a diagnosis had been much broadened, and the tent became larger and larger and included more and more and more women.
To add to that, another problem is, well, first of all, PTSD being a normal reaction to trauma just doesn't kind of translate when we look at other places in the world.
No, culturally, it's just absolutely terrible.
Yeah. And the second issue is we necessitate that verbalization, the talking about it has to be the only way to to process trauma. So that again becomes a problem, that you have to go to a professional and you have to talk about it. And that's the only way you can process this. Which again, it just doesn't work like that.
No. And we, as cultures, we decide, what is normal, right? And what is not. So Derek Summerfield talks about this, and it's really wonderful work. It's sort of, what do we in our society or some other society call normal? What do we say we should have to endure, or we should be able to endure, without calling it a problem? Mm-hmm. So if we think about something like the response of the British during the bombing of London, for example, and, the fact is that Londoners were not calling themselves traumatized. There wasn't any language, and there was no narrative for that. There was an attitude of, keep calm and carry on, stiff upper lip, and all the rest. Now, if people, of course, were suffering horribly, then there was no real way to cope with that, even in war. I mean, shell shock was considered a humiliation for soldiers. All of this was terrible. And yet, it was so different from our 9/11 response. It's very interesting. Probably the same percentage of people were utterly traumatized and very disturbed by the bombings in London as were disturbed in Manhattan, on the day of 9/11. And yet we had that different discourse.
You've written a book, One Nation Under Stress, and you've kind of said that the side disciplines overall focus more on the effects of stress and being stressed out rather than, looking at the causes of stress.
Right.
And the way our individualized kind of culture plays a part in it. So could you tell us a little bit about what are the issues with the way we talk about stress? Yeah. And maybe if you have a story or an example, that would be really cool.
Well, to make a little bridge between our last discussion about trauma and stress, I think both of these concepts now share the same kind of problem. The cause and the effect are conjoined in a way that make them one, with the exception that it's the emotional response that we focus on. So the thing that stresses you out, the stressor, and your reaction to it are both stresses. They're stress. They're both, but what we focus on is the emotional, the feeling of being stressed. I talk a lot in that book about this sort of crazy concept, American idea of balance, right? Okay. For instance, say that you are a working mother. I'll use mothers because women are targeted for this stress discourse. But, so you're a working woman. You may be working shift work. You may not be well paid, or you might be a professional woman. Okay, so this discourse of balance applies to everybody equally, even though the stressors are quite different. The woman who's the CEO, who can have a nanny, is not in the same position as the woman who finds out that she's working a crazy shift this week and she had no notice and can't get any childcare. But there's a middle class idea about balance that's supposed to apply to everybody. And that is that we're supposed to achieve a sort of balance between what we're doing out there, what we're doing in the family, and that we're supposed to take really good care of ourselves, no matter what the outer stressors are, what the context of our lives are. And therefore, if we can do that, we won't be stressed out and we won't be angry, and we'll be able to take care of all the people we have to take care of. And I think that this promotes and really it supports the feminization of care. Well, when I say feminization of care, I shouldn't really call it that. Care has been women's province in this country for, as long as any of us can remember in historical time, particularly since when industrialization came to America, really. So bourgeois women, middle-class women were to stay home while men went to the office. They were no longer full partners on the farm. They were no longer just taking a share of the work, and everybody, children, partners, women themselves, taking equal share in the work. It became women's province to care for the family, for the children, to take care. As middle-class women, particularly flooded into the workplace in the 1980s and beyond, the expectation of care did not change. But now the expectation of balance has become another weight on the shoulders of women. I can use myself as an example. I can tell you, I never called myself stressed out the entire time. I had no money. I was a single parent. I was doing my doctorate one course at a time and taking care of my son, a dog, the school turtle, everything else. And that's when the superwoman narrative was in vogue, and my expectation was that I do everything perfectly. So from that era in the middle class life, we went on to this idea about balance and juggling, that we should be able to juggle multiple things. If we can't, if something drops, it's our fault. We blame ourselves. And we should indulge in, we should buy more commodities that will help us, And of course, if you're poor, and you can't afford to take the time, have the money, or have the support necessarily to do the kind of caretaking things that middle class culture tells us we should do.
That's where the narrative of self-care enters, and
right.
Is the same thing, that self-care is so important. And I have to kind of break that for my students very often. Like, candles in a bath are not going to solve problems that emerge from poverty and,
But when we call it stress, we then flatten, that you're quite right. I mean, I what you're saying is exactly what I've been saying, and it's so true, but the idea of stress kind of flattens this out. If we say we're stressed, we can say, oh, this is a problem. It's my problem to solve also.
So would I be right in saying that stress is one way to kind of individualize this, and then the diagnosis from borderline to PTSD are more specific ways to individualize certain bigger problems around us? Would that be accurate?
Well, I think that I don't want to put the borderline diagnosis sort of in the stress bucket necessarily. So many of the women who are diagnosed borderline now are women who have suffered, the extremes of abuse of all kinds, neglect and invalidation. So it's, I don't want to sort of throw that into the stress bucket. But I think that stress is a sort of non-diagnostic tool, for those women who tend to, as many of us do, take our cues from popular culture.
Maybe an example or a personal story. I have a 3-week-old baby now, and anytime I feel kind of a little overwhelmed, a part of my mind is going postpartum depression. Doesn't matter if I've read about massive criticisms of the concept. I understand how culturally narrow it is. And the fact that I have a broken ankle and it's just me and my husband. If I was back in India, I would have had 18 relatives helping us out.
Right.
But it's interesting that despite having all of those, knowing that there are these massive external factors and I have to go back to school, and being a critical psychologist, still in the back of my head, the postpartum depression light just keeps, I'm like, wow, that the power of these narratives is so strong. Doesn't matter if, you're aware of them. It's terrible. Almost.
And if we're just stressed out, let me go back to the stress concept. If we're just stressed out, then because we blame ourselves for not taking better care of ourselves, there's no need then to go outside and say, why are we still the only Western industrialized nation that does not have any paid family leave, right? Why is childcare, why do we not have universal pre-K? All of these things, and as women will tell you, the ones who are the most stressed out doing trying to hold up all of this, they don't have time for activism, right? So this is another part of the problem. I'm too stressed to get out there. I don't even have time to call my congressperson or write, or, I sign a petition or, so it's a way of easing ourselves, easing our consciences too, that we can say, well, I'm stressed out. I'll put some candles, take the bubble bath and, eat more kale and make a smoothie and buy a yoga mat. And, and then of course, when we think about women in our country who don't have the option to do any of those things or have any help. And as you suggest, the community, we're not looking to the community as you would if you were back in India. We're not looking to a community necessarily to help us with this.
There has been a recent conversation around what is called structural determinants of mental health, right? The UN is talking about it. Issues such as racism, poverty, gender discrimination, violence. I wonder if it's going to also get co-opted and absorbed, or it's just paying lip service, saying structural determinants of mental health, and then going back and doing the same thing, which is, hey, let's do one-on-one therapy.
That's what worries me. I mean, if you look at what's happened, say, in poor neighborhoods in the public school system, and I'm very familiar with that. I used to do family therapy and we worked with the public school systems. If you look at what happens when a child has problems, we can understand discrimination. We can understand the effects of poverty. We can understand bullying. We can understand, all kinds of things that contribute to a child not doing well in school or acting out, having problems. What do we do about that? It's not that we don't understand some of that. What do we do? First, we call the mother in. The mother, only the mother. The mother's problem. Now she has to take the child to therapy. often the therapist is actually not trained to as a family therapist. So the mother is basically the child is with the therapist who's very understanding, for 45 minutes a week. And the child goes back into the environment, which, and the mother doesn't have any more support than she had before, nor does she have any much understanding of what's happening in the therapy because she's not included in that. So it's not an exact answer to your question. But, when I was studying the stress phenomenon, I found some really interesting and crazy popular articles, for instance, about poverty and depression.
Yeah.
This really worried me. This was the beginning, to my mind, of how these things are getting co-opted by the medical establishment. Let's treat the depression, right? So many people who are poor are depressed. How do we? This becomes the same problem as the trauma and stress problems. You get this sort of external cause becomes shunted aside for the emotional after effects of it. And it's so much easier to deal with the effects. I mean, to deal with discrimination, to deal with poverty and racism, to deal with differences in tax dollars going to schools in poor neighborhoods as opposed to affluent neighborhoods and all. We don't have to deal with that. It creates a perfect environment for us to individualize these problems. And it really is a worry, despite the fact that there's really good work going on.
Since we're talking about kind of being able to ignore larger systemic issues and focusing on only one thing, I'm going to ask you about positive psychology. Right? And you have said that there are certain issues with what positive psychology says, at least in a simplified form. Could you tell us, what is it that you've talked about in, problematizing positive psychology and things that it talks about?
It's interesting, the same kind of idea that one had about say PTSD opening up and, we're going to contextualize all these problems, Well, the positive psychologists, you'd think, psychology's turning to context. Psychology has often, as a field, as a profession, been really acontextual. One of the things that Jean Marisek and I argued in a couple of articles that we wrote, was that, first of all, the idea of positive psychology bolstered the profession of psychology at a time when there were great inroads being made through managed care, social workers becoming therapists, the professionalization of counseling, and all of these things. So a new field, a new area for us. The problem was that positive psychology is just about as acontextual as any other form of individual psychology. So I sort of label positive psychology as yet another among the many adjustment psychologies that we have loved in America for decades and decades. And by adjustment psychology, I mean those kind of movements like the mental hygiene movement, in which the goal was to produce these happy, healthy, quote, well-adjusted individuals in the terms of the larger society. So, for instance, when we talk about balance, when I was talking about stress and balance before, a well-adjusted woman by those standards, for instance, would be a woman who can take care of herself, take care of her family, do all this without a lot of complaint and angst and anger and so on. That would be ideal adjustment in those terms. So the problem is that if you talk about what kinds of families result in children who flourish, and that's the quotation from Seligman and others, you can't do it without thinking about what kind of environment the family is situated in. right? So how do you talk about creating families in which children flourish without thinking about institutions and social context for families? In what institutions are governing how families raise children? And this is different depending on where you are in society in this country, right? So if we talk about flourishing, the family itself is too small. The nuclear family is much too small an environment to look at. And those of us who've I've been trained in trained therapists in multidimensional family therapy, which is a model that looks at the much larger, broader context of families and also attempts to make those connections and help families make those connections with those broader institutions. Otherwise, we can't focus on simply the dynamics of a family and then say we're going to help that family to create well-being among children. Another example, of course, Martin Seligman had a huge contract with the United States government to bring positive psychology to the military. So say that you have a soldier who's going off to war, who's afraid of being killed, who's going to have to presumably kill other people and see maiming and watch other people die. And you're going to inoculate them somehow with positive psychology against these horrors. We're not going to talk about war and the phenomenon of war and what it brings. We're not even going to talk about male socialization and how we create warriors, right? The gendered creation of warriors. We're not going to talk about any of that. We're just going to train people in how to be more resilient. One of the things that I came upon in reading a lot in this area when I was writing the book on stress was this concept of moral injury, which is another sort of internalization of a problem that is much larger. When the military talks about moral injury, it's individualizing a problem that's created because there is the existence of war and because of political decisions that are made to create warlike conditions. So we're then saying that are we saying the soldier has caused a moral injury? I'm interested in this because we don't talk about that. We don't talk about soldiers creating moral injury in others. We talk about the moral injury somehow to them. And I think that anything that uses the medicalized language of injury, if we're talking about health and injury, then we're into the land of trauma again. Our entire discussion in many ways just curves in upon itself.
All right. That kind of closes our interview. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. Visit madinamerica.com for more news, views, and updates.